September of 1987, there's an empty commuter flight flying from Portland, Maine to Boston. Henry Dempsey, the pilot, hears an unusual noise in the rear of his small aircraft, and he turns the controls of the plane over to his co-pilot, and he heads into the back of the cabin to check things out. And I take the following from an article in the New York Times dated 5 September 1987. When the aircraft hit some turbulence, Mr. Dempsey then leans against the door in the rear of the aircraft, which was hinged at the bottom, and the stairway door opened. Can you imagine? You're flying on a plane and you lean against the door and it opens while you're in the air. He tumbles forward, grabs the railings as he falls, and lays upside down on the stairs as the plane is cruising at 190 miles per hour at an altitude of 4,000 feet. The article says that he was partially inside the aircraft and partially outside of the plane. The co-pilot, Paul Bosher of Lynn, Massachusetts, saw the door ajar indicator light on the control panel, and he realized something had happened, so he changes course and flies to Portland International Jetport. Now, I read another article telling me that when he saw that indicator light, he actually called the Coast Guard, thinking that the pilot who he was with, his friend, was pulled out of the aircraft from that door flying open. Can you imagine? The plane then proceeds to land, and Mr. Dempsey's, the pilot's face, is 12 inches above the runway as he's hanging halfway out of the plane. Boucher, the co-pilot, didn't realize Dempsey was hanging on until the plane was already on the ground. Those at the scene reported that once the plane had successfully landed, it took several airport security personnel 5 minutes simply to pry the pilot's hands off of the railing of that door stairway hatch. When I first read that, I thought about it for a minute. You know, that's an interesting image of what life can feel like sometimes, isn't it? You feel like you're cruising along, high performance, everything's going well, and then all of a sudden, bam, a door flies open and you're hanging on for your dear life at 190 miles an hour. Last week, Brian introduced us to Joseph. And if anyone in the scriptures knew what that must have felt like, to be hanging on for dear life as his life is traveling at a fast pace and he goes from rags to riches, what it must have felt like to be traveling at life, the speed of life, 190 miles an hour. It was Joseph. One minute he's enjoying his 17-year-old, seemingly a senior year in high school, and the next minute he's ripped from his life, away from his family, sold into slavery in a foreign country. If you want to follow along with me this morning, we're going to look more at his life and take a deeper look at the beginning of his journey. You're going to turn to Genesis chapter 37, and you can follow along with the church app, or you can follow along with me on screen. And as we dive into this further, I want you to notice a couple of things as I share some of the story with you for the sake of time, because we're going to cover a lot of ground. You're going to have to stick with me this morning. There's a lot I want to cover. And I'm also going to read some of the story. I want you to notice two things. One, I want you to pick up on Joseph's behavior. How is he acting and how is he speaking to others around him? And the second thing I want you to pick up on as we look at this story is, how are those around him responding to his actions and his behaviors? Let's look at verse 2 as we jump in. Joseph, a young man of 17, he's tending flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah. Those are his father's wives. And he brought their father a bad report about them. Joseph, already right at the beginning of this story, he's turning into the family tattletale. And if you grew up with siblings, you know what this is like, where a couple of your siblings, you go through some experience with them, and they run off to mom and dad, and they tell mom and dad the story, their version of the story before you can get there. And then everybody gets in trouble, mostly you, because you didn't get to share your side of the story. That is what Joseph's brothers are dealing with. And as you can imagine, this doesn't help Joseph's relationships in the family. And his dad doesn't help things improve either. Take a look, verse 3. Now Israel, another name for Jacob, Joseph's father, loved Joseph more. He loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he had been born to him at such an old age. So what we learn here is that Joseph is daddy's favorite. But what the text shares that's significant is dad didn't just like Joseph more. No, dad flat out loved Joseph more. He loved Joseph more, and it was demonstrated by what he did for Joseph. Look at the rest of verse 3. Not only had he been born to him in his old age, but his dad also had made an ornate robe for Joseph. The robe. The coat of many colors, the Technicolor dream coat, what Joseph is famous for, what you may have heard about in a musical or what you may have heard about growing up in Sunday school as a kid. This made Joseph famous. Now, if you're using a King James version here this morning, you would have noticed that the coat in King James is described as the coat of many colors, but in our NIV version, it's described as an ornate robe. That's because of a translation issue that occurred in the 4th century. Most scholars today believe that Joseph's robe was not one that was colorful, and thus our modern translation says it was an ornate robe. What scholars do agree upon is that no matter what it looked like, it was an elaborate garment. A garment, a robe, a coat that separated Joseph from everyone else, just simply in how he looked. And dad gave Joseph this gift because he loved him. And the robe would have been worn by someone of status, someone maybe even of royal status, someone who had a higher place in society. Either way, it set Joseph apart from the rest of his brothers and the rest of the family. And you can only imagine how Joseph's brothers felt when he's a tattletale, but he's also getting special gifts from dad. Look at verse 4. When his brothers saw that his father loved him more than any of them, they hated him. They hated him. And they couldn't speak a kind word to him because now his brothers, they're not only hearing this idea that, yeah, dad likes Joseph more, loves Joseph more than the rest of us, but now they're seeing it. They're actually seeing Joseph be loved more than the rest of them. And so their feelings change. They're not just aggravated by what's going on in the relationship. They actually start to hate Joseph. And that hatred begins to come out and is manifested. It comes to life in their words and conversations with one another. The text told us that they can't speak a kind word to their own brother because of how much hatred they have for him. And it doesn't get any better because then Joseph shares a dream. He's hanging out with his brothers and he tells them about this dream he has, that he feels like God even gave him this dream. And he begins to describe what occurred in the dream, that they're all out in the fields and they're gathering grain. And as they pull this grain together in bundles, these sheaves of grain, Joseph's bundle of grain, his sheaf of grain stands higher and taller than anyone else's. And their sheaves of grain, their bundles, bow down to the ground in front of Joseph's grain. How do you think the brothers may have felt after Joseph shares this dream? It sounds a little bit arrogant, doesn't it? Joseph, what? You already know that dad loves you more. Why are you telling us these dreams, Joseph? You trying to make it worse for yourself? Really? Look at what his brothers say, verse 8. Do you intend to reign over us, Joseph? Really? Will you actually rule us? And they hated him all the more. And notice this, because of the dream, and what else? And because what Joseph said. Now, that's interesting here. The text doesn't tell us what else Joseph may have said. It tells us the dream, gives us a complete record of the dream, and you can read through it for yourself. Brian challenged us to read through these number of chapters last week. It tells us what the dream was, but it doesn't tell us that extra conversation, what else he had said. Which leads me to believe that Joseph was carrying a bit of arrogance with him because of the extra niceties he got from his dad. Then Joseph goes on to have a second dream. And this time, when he tells the second dream, he doesn't just tell it to his brothers when they're hanging out by themselves. No, he waits until the whole family's together. He's got dad in the room. Why does he wait for dad? Why do you think that might be? Just speculate for a moment. I think it's because he was afraid of getting punched in the nose. He was afraid about what his brothers might do if he went on and shared this second dream. And so then, again, all the imagery in the second dream ties down to the whole family now, not just the brothers bowing down before Joseph. And it gets to the point where dad even gets a little annoyed. Jacob rebukes Joseph. But his brothers continue to be jealous. Look at verse 11. His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. And that's, I think, because Jacob knew. Yeah, Joseph may be a bit arrogant, but Jacob knew there was something special about Joseph. Something special about his skill set, his leadership ability, maybe his ability to administrate the family ranch. He knew that Joseph had something special. And that's why he had him checking up on the others from time to time. And that's what happens again next in the story. Joseph is asked by Jacob to go out and follow up with his brothers who are out dealing with the livestock in the field. But what I've got to give Joseph credit for is, despite all of the pressure and anxiety he must have felt about his relationship with his brothers, even in the middle of that stress, we can learn something. Joseph never let go of the dream. That's the first thing I want you to learn from Joseph's story this morning, is that God doesn't bring the dream to life until he actually tests the dreamer. And this is what Brian introduced to us last week, this idea that sometimes God has to refine the dreamer before he can bring the dream to life. And Joseph was one of those guys who's not going to let the dream go. He's not going to let it go just because there's opposition. And where are you in life right now? Do you feel like God has something more for you? Do you feel like God wants to do something bigger and greater with you? Let me remind you what we talked about last week. God has a plan for your life. He has a purpose. Don't let go of the dream simply because you've started experiencing some opposition to it. Well, as Joseph goes back out to the field as instructed by Jacob, his brothers see him in the distance. And as they see Joseph approaching with his fancy coat, the text says they begin plotting to kill their own brother. That's how much tension has developed in these relationships in this family. They begin plotting to kill their own brother. Look at what it says. Here comes that dreamer, they say to each other. Come on now, let's kill him. Let's throw him into one of these cisterns and say a ferocious animal had devoured him, and then we'll see. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams. Their own brother. Luckily, the eldest of the brothers, Reuben, begins trying to talk some sense into these guys. And he says, look, guys, let's not take his life. Don't shed any blood. Look at verse 22. Don't shed any blood. Let's just throw him into the cistern here in the wilderness, but nobody lay a hand on him. Don't physically hurt him. Reuben is hoping to get Joseph safely back home to dad. But when Reuben steps away, the other brothers have an agenda. All right, if Reuben doesn't want us to let us kill him, we're certainly not letting him go home because we want Joseph out. And they happen to see a traveling caravan of slavers go by. And as the Midianites approach, they sell Joseph. They sell their own brother into slavery to get rid of him. And verse 31 tells us the plan that they came up with to explain their own brother's disappearance. Look at what it says. They got Joseph's robe. They slaughter a goat, dip the robe in the blood, then they take the ornate robe back to their father and say, "Dad, we found this. Examine it to see whether or not it's your son's robe." Jacob recognizes it. It says, "It is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal must have devoured him. Joseph surely has been torn to pieces." And then Jacob tears his own clothes, puts on sackcloth, and begins to mourn for his son for many days. All his sons and daughters come to comfort him, but he refuses to be comforted. "No," he says, "in mourning I will go down to the grave of my son." And so the father weeps for Joseph. Meanwhile, the slavers, the Midianites, sell Joseph in Egypt. He's taken away from his homeland. No family, no friends, no one he knows. And he's sold to a man named Potiphar, who happens to be one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of Potiphar's guard. So if there was ever a guy in biblical history, ever a guy who knows what it's like to be cruising, seemingly going high performance, all is good, all is well, and then he's ripped out of his normal MO, hanging on at 190 miles an hour, hanging on for dear life, it's Joseph. Joseph knows what that's like. But my question, and I'm sure a question that all of us would have, is why? Why does God allow this to happen? Not only to Joseph, but to us. Why does God allow me to end up in situations where I feel like I'm hanging on at 190 miles an hour? And I think this is a question that we all ask. Even people who don't believe as we believe. George Barna, he's a well-known Christian researcher. And he did a national survey across the United States asking people who don't attend church regularly if this question right here, if you could ask God one question and you knew that God was going to give you an answer, what would you ask him? What would you ask him? Overwhelmingly, the response was this: God, why is there pain and suffering in our world? God, why do you allow us to suffer? And this is a question that's important for us, especially those of us who say we believe. Because if we believe in a God who loves us and cares for us, certainly that God would have the power as the creator of the universe to stop suffering. So why doesn't he? God, why do you allow me to suffer? But to help us answer that question, I want us to do a little activity together. You ready for a little activity? Come to church. We're going to do a little activity together. Here's the activity. The activity is called this. You're going to be president in 13 years. You're going to be president in the year 2032. It's election year. Everyone's thinking who's going to rule the country, who's going to rule the nation. That person is you. So let me ask you this question. How are you going to prepare for it? Talk about that with the person next to you. Here's the question. Throw that question up on the screen for me. How are you going to prepare yourself to be president in 13 years? Ask the person next to you. I'm going to give you about 20 seconds. Go. So first service, check this out. First service, someone said, "I'm deleting Twitter. I'm not going to manage policy through social media. I'm deleting Twitter." I've heard lots of different responses. I walked around up front. Some people said, "I'm going to do some research on government and how to put in good policy." Some people said, "I'm going to hide the fact that I'm too young to be president." Some people said, "I'm going to go back to school." How many of you go back to school? Get some more education? Few of you? Yeah? You know what God did for Joseph? You think God sent Joseph back to school? Get educated in some international policy and politics? Nope. Maybe God would have sent a mentor to Joseph to help him raise himself up as a leader so he could follow someone else who's doing it well. Nope. God didn't do any of that. You know what God did for Joseph? He allowed him to experience 13 years of pain. Joseph finds himself in this exact situation. This exact situation. It's like there is a king, there's royalty in Egypt, the biggest superpower of his day. And Joseph finds himself landing right there. And the king is going to appoint him as prime minister. He's going to run the show. That's the situation Joseph finds himself in. Look at Genesis 37:2. It says, Joseph was a young man of 17, and he has a dream. And then we fast forward a few chapters, Genesis chapter 41. Joseph is now 30 years old, and he enters into the service of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. What happens in that gap? Suffering. Here's a little chart of Joseph's life. Look at this real quick. The first 17 years of Joseph's life, he finds himself growing up as a child, and many of us would say, he was a spoiled child at that. He was daddy's favorite. The next 13 years until he gets to 30 years away from home. It's pain and slavery, 13 years. And then the next 80 years, he finds himself running the show in Egypt. So why suffer? Why does God allow us to suffer? I think if Jesus were here, he may even use Joseph as an example. And he'd say this. Jesus would say, sometimes I allow you to suffer so I can show others that you genuinely believe in me. Sometimes, even at the hands of the very people who are causing the pain in your life, sometimes those people could be your family or your friends. And Jesus told his followers about this as well. Look at Matthew chapter 5. He says, blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. And in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. See, friends, while Jesus has this message of hope and healing that he wants us to share with the world around us, he doesn't promise that as we share it, it's going to be all rainbows and unicorns. Nowhere does Jesus promise that his followers are going to be shielded somehow from suffering and pain. In fact, he promises just the opposite. It's going to become more difficult. And Christian tradition and Christian history point this out as well. Look at this list. The Apostle Andrew, crucified in the city of Edessa when he's strapped to a cross and hung for days before he died. Peter, he spent 9 months in prison in Rome. And then he was almost beaten to death and then crucified upside down on a cross. And during all of that mess, Peter actually helps others meet Jesus. He helps others meet Jesus, the prison guards that were with him and 47 other prisoners. The Apostle Paul was imprisoned in Rome and then later beheaded for the faith. John was the only one to escape a completely violent death, but even he was exiled onto the island of Patmos. And the story goes on. James, Philip, Matthew, Mark, Matthias, Jude, Bartholomew, Thomas, Luke, all suffered as martyrs for the faith. And so why suffering? Because suffering plays a very important role in our development, in the development of our faith, and in the development of those who are watching us suffer, the people in our circle of influence around us as we suffer. They see us suffer. They look and see how we handle that suffering. And in that suffering, are we pointing people to God? That's what happens with Joseph. Look at verses 3 and 4 of chapter 39. Look at how God uses Joseph's suffering. It says, when his master Potiphar saw what? That the Lord was with him, the Lord was with Joseph, and the Lord gave him success in everything he did. Potiphar is observing Joseph in a life of servitude as a slave for 13 years. How does Joseph handle this change in lifestyle? He points Potiphar to God. He sees the Lord gives him success in everything he did. Joseph found favor in Potiphar's eyes, becomes his attendant, and Potiphar puts him in charge of his whole house. He takes care of everything Potiphar owns. So maybe you're here today and you're going through a tough time. You're going through some sort of transition in your family, in your life, in your career. Maybe there are people saying things about you or doing something to you, or maybe God's allowing you to go through some significant pain. People are watching to see how you're handling that situation, and are you allowing God, your Father, your Heavenly Father, to sustain you through it? I mean, reflect for a moment. Just step out of Joseph's story for a moment and think about the people in your life that you respect the most, the people in your life that you look up to, that you admire. Why is it that you respect them and admire them? Is it because you've watched them or heard about their suffering and what they've turned it into and how they've used it and how God may have even used it for something good? That is what's happening in Joseph's life. And friends, that's what should be happening in our lives. If Jesus were here and asked this question about why suffering, I think he'd also say this. I think he'd say, sometimes I allow you to suffer to grow your character. To grow your character. See, friends, there were things that Joseph needed to address in his life so that God could prepare him to become the leader of the most powerful nation in his time. Just maybe there are things that God is doing in your life to mold and shape your character. You know why I believe Jesus would say that? I believe Jesus would say that because of his brother James. James, the brother of Jesus, wrote one of the texts that we have in our New Testament. And can you imagine being the brother of Jesus? If your brother or sibling said, oh, and by the way, I'm the Son of God. What that would have been like to live with that? That's what James had to deal with. And he didn't start out believing. James only believed later in life. And look at what James says. He says, consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may become mature and complete, not lacking anything. Does God have some kind of work he wants to finish in you? Is there a part of you that's not mature and complete that he's working on? Is God molding and shaping your character? And if that's the case, then how do I endure? When I know that I have to persevere and face the opposition that I feel in my life, when I have to go through some suffering, how exactly do I know that I can get through it? Well, it brings me back to what we saw Potiphar seeing when he looked at Joseph. Potiphar says that the Potiphar saw that the Lord was with Joseph. Don't forget that. Friends, God is with you. Even in the middle of whatever opposition you're facing, even in the middle of your suffering and pain, God is with you. That's how you're going to endure. That reminds me of my friend Lindsay. Lindsay, if I know anyone in this world who was dealing with the most intense physical pain, it's my friend Lindsay. She had a condition called CRPS, and that stands for chronic regional pain syndrome. And how this comes out in most people is they'll have a part of their body, a hand, an arm, maybe a leg, a part of their body that's in significant pain all the time. But for Lindsay, that pain was different because she felt like her skin was on fire across her whole body all the time, 24 hours a day. Can you imagine? Feeling like your entire body is lit on fire. When the ambulance drivers would take her back and forth to the hospital as she's trying to get some sort of pain management. And by the way, she was dealing with this for 6 years. 6 years, this kind of pain. Laying in bed, she couldn't get out of bed. When she would eat, she would have, because she was mostly fed by a tube, she would literally take a sip just to get a little water in her mouth or a crumb to taste something once in a while. That's how intense it was. When the ambulance drivers would take her back and forth to the hospital, the drivers would have to pull over for a break on the side of the highway to wipe the tears from their own eyes because of how loud and intense her screams were from the vibration of the ambulance driving down the road. That's how bad it was. One week she called us up here at the church and she asked if we would bring her communion. And so I show up in her room and she's got bringing communion with me, and she's got an ice pack sitting in the middle of her chest, just helping to distract her from the pain, and a sheet that's covering her body because she couldn't wear clothes all that much. She was excited. She said, "I'm so excited because I'm going to Mexico." I said, "Really? You're going to Mexico? What for?" "Well, they have a treatment and it might help me. It might actually completely take all of my pain away." And I said, "That's great." Then I asked her, I said, "Lindsay, how in the world are you going to fly to Mexico?" I said, "It's crazy amounts of pain just simply driving from your own home to the hospital in an ambulance. How are you going to go to the airport and then get onto a plane and fly to Mexico? How is that possible? How are you going to do that?" And this is what she said. Let me quote. She said, "Frank, I really don't know, to be honest. What I do know is that I don't need that piece of it yet. What I do know is that God will give me what I need to get through this moment. And when I'm on that plane or in that ambulance, God will give me what I need to get through that part of it then, and only then, not before." So friends, maybe you're here today and you're experiencing some sort of challenge in your own life. Let me remind you, the Lord is with you, and He evidenced that more through the sacrifice of His own Son, Jesus, than in anything else. I mean, we see in this story how much how much Jacob loved his son, Joseph. Friends, Jesus was sacrificed because His Father, our Heavenly Father, loves you enough to sacrifice His own Son. God is with you. Let's remember that. As we share in the bread and the cup, the ushers are going to pass the trays containing both. Take one of each and hold on to it, and we'll eat and drink after everyone's been served.